تبدو آثاره انفجار ثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're talking to Alex Hochuli, co-host of BungaCast, co-author of The End of History, Politics in the 21st Century, author and researcher, freelancer for Jacobin, Current Affairs and Damage, and also he is part of the Damage editorial staff collective.
Something like that.
Yeah.
American Affairs rather than Current Affairs, actually.
Yes, American Affairs. So I wanted to talk to you today about the end of history, but in specific to the South American context, and then your forgive me for using Spanish as opposed to Portuguese, but your Norteño brothers up here and their interpretations and misinterpretations thereof. But before we go into that, since we're going into some of the nitty-gritty on Brazil, Bolsonaro's future doesn't look so hot right now, at least from the way it's reported in the United States. But what is going to replace it seems most likely the Workers' Party and Lula. But there's a lot of things that could happen. Would you like to give the current context for Brazilian politics, from your standpoint in São Paulo right now?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. And I'm looking forward to having this chat. I'm trying to think of how to summarize the current state of affairs without making it seem boring, because the reality is that, Brazil has been in crisis of some form or another for almost 9 years. And that's quite a long time. And we can go into what exactly those have been and where we are now. But the state of affairs is that Bolsonaro is very weak. He's weak in terms of not having support. He has his hardcore base of maybe 20% of the population, but isn't able to really grow beyond that. And he is really completely beholden to a group which is called the Centrão in Brazil, but it's a collection of parties called the Big Center. Now, they're not center, they're kind of center-right, but they're really called physiological parties because they just make up the body politic. They are vehicles for pork and vehicles for random local elites to get elected and to get money off the state, effectively. And he's completely beholden to them. And he's had to do that because he lost kind of support elsewhere in society. As things stand, Lula will go to a second round against, he'll win the first round, but he'll go to a second round against Bolsonaro and he'll win that second round. So, maybe your listeners are like, well, that's great. This is like a kind of left-wing government, or at least a center-left government, which is coming to power. And maybe, with other things going on in the rest of the continent, with like Chile electing a left-wing government, Colombia even looking like it might move to the left for the first time in its history, that things are looking kind of bright. What's important to understand about Lula in this election is that it's kind of sold on the idea of a return to the good old days, which were never that good in the first place, and with no real radical program of transforming society. That's actually putting it too grandly, but not even really rolling back a lot of the cuts to the state that have happened over the past 5 years. And he's made an alliance, and it looks like who is going to be his vice president. The center-right ex-member now of the Brazilian Social Democratic Party, which is a center-right neoliberal party, who ran against him in 2006. So the second round election was against him, who was a former governor of São Paulo, and demonized by the left, and now is going to be, most likely, it looks like, Lula's vice president. And Lula has been sewing up alliances all across the political spectrum, getting a lot of these elements of the Centrão behind him, and has even had chats apparently with the military, because he's very scared. And here there might be good cause for concern of what the military might do if he wins, despite the lack of substantial threat, or any threat really, that he might pose to Brazilian capitalism. So I guess that's where we are. But all politics, to a certain extent, have been dominated by the pandemic for the past few years. Brazil has been very badly hit by the pandemic. You had a president who just washed his hands of doing anything about it, and has been, sowing misinformation, consistently about it, and diminishing the seriousness of the pandemic. 600,000 people have died. So, we can maybe come on to debate COVID, I guess, and I guess we will. But it's very hard here to be completely dismissive of it and say, no, this is just the biosecurity state growing and taking control of everything, because we don't have that much of that stuff. And we do have a lot of deaths, and a public health system which is underfunded and has been unable to really cope.
So, I mean, one thing I will say about BungaCast is a lot of people have, perhaps fairly, perhaps unfairly, accused you guys of being at least sympathetic to the post or anti-left Marxist movement. But do you
First
think,
I hear of it.
Yeah, I've heard it. But one thing I would say to that is that I think that's reading everything in a solely U.S. context and actually not listening to what you say about COVID, where a lot of the post or anti-left have taken highly COVID skeptical, if not almost outright denialist or conspiratorial positions. And they haven't all, so I shouldn't tar them completely with that. But there's been enough that it's been an identifiable tracker. And it's weirdly in the United States, more than other places, the variety of confidence and the type of mis or disinformation that you spread is now become a good indicator of your political sympathies, even beyond what you say you are. And that's quite strange, actually. And and there are left parties across the world that are lockdown skeptical, which I actually do not think it's as unreasonable a position as people think, even though I am probably more agnostic on it. Looking at the actual data, lockdown efficacy over the long term seems somewhat questionable. However, a lot of places have a lot of dead. If per capita, Brazil's outdoing the United States, is it not?
I think so. I can't remember now anymore, because you reach a certain point, you just get sick of the figures and checking in on it. But I should say, go ahead. Sorry.
We're at something like 4/5 here. So,
yeah. I mean, I should say, first of all, lest my co-hosts George and Phil kill me, we have different views on COVID. We've endlessly debated it and got angry at each other and whatever. We're still friends. And in general, we kind of try to debate things and often have different initial views on things. So I don't want to pretend to speak for them on this. And maybe it's because, and I've insisted on this throughout the pandemic, that kind of where you sit determines a little bit where you stand. And so from what national context you're speaking, like the internet makes us feel like we're all part of the same global, cyberspace. But the reality is that what provokes, so you're, for example, you're sat at home and you're driven crazy by the fact the bar's not open. You can't go to bars. You can't do anything. Your social life has withered to nothing, or to withered just to online meetings. So you have your work online meetings, and then you have your supposedly leisure online meetings. And, and you complain about lockdown, but what you mean by lockdown is completely different to the guy in Germany who's talking about lockdown, which is different to the guy who's in Brazil talking about it, different to the guy in a red state in the US, and so on. So
Yeah.
I think
As a person
lot.
in Utah, I can vouch for this. When people talk about this and experience it from California, I have no idea what they're talking about.
Well, exactly. Or we assume we're saying the same thing, that lockdown means the same thing, but it's a whole variety of measures and so on. Does it mean that you just don't have big events and that you have to sometimes wear a mask, or does it mean that you have to show a pass to leave your house or to go more further than a kilometer from your house, as people in France had to do? So I think that's like the first thing to say, lest we misunderstand each other. We've been, I think, and this I can say, is we've all been skeptical of lockdowns from early on. I mean, at least and I think here's the firmest ground, just on civil liberties grounds, that no matter the emergency, that the prevention of or the prohibition of gathering publicly outdoors is just is unconscionable. The left can't defend that unless it is an emergency on the scale of something like Ebola, where you have like a 50% death rate. And it's troubling how many people have thrown themselves into endorsement of kind of emergency politics, almost as if it satisfied some desire for the state to do something, the state to take charge, and for authority really to be shown. And I've made this point before, like I think on our podcast and maybe on Twitter, but like I think there is now a desire for like a resolution to kind of postmodern authority where decision making is disparate. It's not done necessarily by it's done by quangos and technical groups and ultimately by finance, whether it be central banks or private finance, that you just want someone to take charge and do something. And I think that's a reasonable desire, I think, faced with kind of this postmodern diffuse authority where politicians never take take responsibility for anything. And really seek to determine outcomes. But what's interesting about this is that you have a kind of right-wing version of that, and which is sort of right populist. And it's funny now when you say right-wing, it's like we've forgotten what kind of conservatism was, I guess, in the kind of 90s and 2000s. What I mean is really the right populist, because right populism has absorbed huge parts of the base of the right in many different countries, and it's something that's happened in Brazil as well, and we'll come on to that. But this desire, like, just do something. So, for example, in Europe, especially in the EU, you don't get to set your border policy, and so the populist right will be like, just stop saying we need to control borders, but then do nothing. Actually, do something. Just stop them. Stop people getting in. That's just it. Draw a line under it. Right now, obviously, I don't share those politics, but what's interesting is that there's a liberal version of this now. It seems as well with the pandemic, where here it's also like, now take action. Now the state needs to step in and make sure that there's no spread of this disease, right? And and take care of our health, and not these half measures. And what's interesting is that everybody's unsatisfied with COVID. So even the kind of zero COVID nuts who want social life never to go back to normal are unsatisfied with the government, because they're like, oh, but you're still allowing people to do stuff. You're still allowing people to have a social life. If you follow their logic, yes, you should be more draconian about it. And so there's this weird thing where the only form of politics around is increasingly hysterical demands for emergency politics from both sides. And that's problematic. That's very bad. It's very bad for democracy, whether it's the kind of withered form of democracy we have now, or a genuine, more fulsome democracy. So I think it's a very difficult debate, and personally, there's never been a political issue over which I've been caused so much angst and anxiety, and wavered on back and forth. Like, there's some things which I've been absolute kind of about, where, like, I think kind of full lockdowns, as I had mentioned, on civil liberty grounds. But the longer it goes on, and the more goalposts are shifted, and even here as well, that you just think, no, this needs to end. And I think it is a political priority to end the kind of sense of permanent state of emergency, even if you want to maintain certain, are in favor of certain anti-COVID policies or whatever. I think it's reached a stage where it is concerning that so many of these things will be made permanent, or at any rate, that the experience of having done them once will allow them to be used again down the road for other means, and then for means which, good left-wing people who care about public health won't be so happy about.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the clearest one is climate change increasing pressures on borders, and particularly when I hear a lot of the left really get doughy-eyed over places like New Zealand, which have always had hyper restrictive immigration policies, and they're basically little islands, which I also point out that most of the world just cannot do and still function. I mean, New Zealand's a country where there's more sheep than people. It's not a viable strategy. And I say that as a person who fully, I am not a vaccine skeptic. I've been mad at the way the CDC has politicized this in various directions, including recently in the way that, Biden got away with something that Trump could have never done, which is the reduction of quarantine suggestions, which again is a suggestion, seemingly at pressure from the state governors and themselves, and their pressure from local economic concerns. But I haven't actually seen that confirmed. It's just the story that makes the most sense, and that I've heard from people in epidemiology trying to explain why the Biden administration didn't follow any scientific recommendations on that wreck. Concurrently, though, I've also seen a lot of people promote lockdowns and whatnot, where I have been just looking at the empirical data and going, well, they might be effective for about 2 weeks. And traditional quarantines can go up to a month. I mean, or 40 days is literally what it means. But no one has ever tried to lock down a country for 2 years.
Yeah.
Ever.
I think we missed the boat kind of in February, March of 2020, most likely. That was when it would have had to have happened. And, and then closing borders and stuff, which, the WHO was pretty adamant that was, in 2019, before any of this started, that should never happen. Right. And it's interesting that all states effectively broke the WHO's own guidance on this, and were far more draconian, and basically followed China's example and went, oh, they're doing that. Let's do that too.
Well, it's funny because unfortunately, while I often think the WHO is more trustworthy than, say, the U.S. CDC or the NIH, that there are clear geopolitical pressures on a lot of these things that you cannot ignore, and that have been somewhat discrediting to every single public health institution on the planet. And I don't think people have really gathered the damage of that and being strongly associated with that, when it also comes to like this strange idea, for example, that a lot of these technocratic epidemiological forces have had, where you don't want to communicate uncertainty to avoid panic. So sometimes you all but outright lie.
Yeah.
So it is, and while I am a dire opponent of COVID misinformation, and there's tons of it out there, I actually do think we have to admit that the CDC and the various health agencies across the world mixed messaging, are not being upfront about why it was messaging something. The first one is masks. Like, why, even though it was only for like 3 weeks, why were they insisting that masks weren't, particularly helpful, and then reverse course on that? Well, they would tell you later that it was because of a possible mass manufacturing shortage, and they didn't want to run a mask for healthcare, and fine, but they didn't say that at the time, or at least not everybody, and not loudly. And these things create the space for these conspiracy theories to emerge. Yeah. And it's irresponsible to pretend like that wouldn't be the case. And to say, frankly, asinine and anodyne things like trust the science is totally degrading, because the scientists are not consistent on what they think all this is.
The biggest threat to science and to expertise itself is the emphasis on expertise the delegating of political authority to experts, and effectively hiding political authority behind expertise. And it's going to be hugely damaging, and that's very bad. I think there is obviously, it's stupid. Like after the populist decade, you kind of almost have to like be defensive about this, but expertise is important. Knowledge, science is important. We can't do without it in modernity. Like, we can be as critical, and we should be absolutely critical of technocracy and the fetishism of expertise. But that doesn't mean that we can somehow do without it. It's I think the withering of trust and the kind of social ungluing that we're seeing with the pandemic, as you said, and actually it's a great example, the competing misinformation. You can tell where someone stands by what misinformation you're in favor of. And okay, it ends up sounding a little bit like, except for me in the center, a good centrist liberal who has the true information. But I don't. That's not what I'm trying to portray. Anyway, the idea of this competing misinformation is telling, I think, that we don't have the kind of shared understanding of reality often, and that's something which I think is something new about our contemporary world, about the end of history, which I don't think we had to reckon with in the same way. I mean, trying to think, we had recently a discussion on the podcast about hyperpolitics, and I'm still unsure about the usage of the term, but the idea is basically we went from kind of apathy and non-involvement in politics, and a recent review of our book pointed out, in fact, like for any older millennial growing up, no one talked about politics, and now everyone talks about politics. And it's not just younger generations, but people I grew up with or went to university who didn't really care about politics. Now everybody has a political opinion on everything, which is a quite significant change. And in that context, like there's politics permeates into kind of interpersonal life in a way that almost as if, needing to convince your uncle at the dinner table of something becomes more important because you're not able to really change the world. The real world doesn't have any traction. And it's hard to think of other episodes in modern history where politics is permeated so deeply and also polarized in random directions. It's not like a kind of clear definitely not a class polarization, and not even a real political polarization, certainly not on kind of left-right terms. It spins off in various different ways, and that's very unique. I mean, that's something which happens maybe in kind of pre-revolutionary periods or in a time of civil war, where politics not just permeates into the kind of intimate sphere, but in which there is a kind of mutual incomprehension, which is really profound. And that's very difficult. I don't know how to get beyond that, because I think anybody saying, double down on, your side or the other side is going to be wrong on this.
I totally agree. And I would actually, I think this is one of the most fascinating things that I've pointed out about in U.S. politics is like the most discourse is about two factions that are at most 10% of society in any given time. However, the ways these other tendrils can dip into those, ideological things that are quite coherent is hard to guess. And yet in another way, what we've also seen, for now at least, is somehow the center, however deracinated and whoever it represents going into this, because it's been different in different countries, has managed to maintain. And that is fascinating. Like, so I like to, the U.S. is strange because I'm not sure the center of politics is electoral politics. I'm increasingly believe that the silent center of American politics is the military. But if you look at the UK and Canada, like dissatisfaction with the Liberal Party in Canada and dissatisfaction with the Tories in the UK is massive. And you might see political leaders change in the case of the Tories in the UK. But from every prediction I have seen, the UK is effectively, for the next decade, a one-party state. It doesn't matter how unpopular the Tories get. And that's wild. And I think we're also seeing that with Canada. I literally can't imagine what would unseat the Liberal Party in Canada at this point.
I think that's right. There has been a sort of centrist restoration.
Mhm.
And here, I'm going to try to phrase this in a way that doesn't sound conspiratorial, but the pandemic came at the right time, because at the end of 2019, like, it's hard to even remember, what life was like then, what was going on. But there was a global revolt against political establishments underway. A lot, of course, in the periphery and semi-periphery. Mentioned Chile already, and that's a great case where they finally overturned the Pinochet constitution. But the kind of populist movements in Europe and North America as well were, in all their different shapes, were, there were just things bubbling up, right? And that delegitimation was very strong. And I think the elites were very lucky that the pandemic came along, and that they did the lockdown not as some sort of plot to, I don't think they did it more than anything because of their lack of withered state capacity. So the kind of austerity had weakened public health systems, of all sorts. They didn't have the means to quickly manufacture masks for people, and so on. And also not the ability to really mobilize people, or the vision to mobilize people, or even they might even have been scared to mobilize people in a certain way, to really take somehow drastic action. That, for example, you keep old people at home and you recruit an army of young people to take care of them, whatever it might be, right? The only thing they could do was completely demobilize society, as a reflex and as a reflection of the fact of the weakness and the lack of state capacity. So I think it's incoherence which drives it. The problem is that they learned a lesson there. It was like, well, this is kind of useful. It's kind of quieting things down. Okay, the US to a certain extent is an exception because you had the whole BLM moment, but that itself just resolved itself into the Democrats, and it was kind of always already perhaps aligned with the Democratic Party, and it was allowed to happen because it was effectively anti-Trump. So but as a consequence, I think there was a lot to be gained for elites to kind of maintain this kind of emergency, this kind of state of emergency around COVID for a long period of time, because it did quieten down what was a kind of bubbling kind of insurrection. I don't want to say that there was just like a revolution was around the corner, not at all. But the fact is that legitimacy of states, and let's just say like Western states for the sake of argument, is seriously damaged. And even belief in democracy, though that's a maybe trickier question, but I think we can say legitimacy at any rate is severely weakened. And as a consequence, what was gonna, I think the only thing that would do that was like anything which would be able to combat that, because it's not like the elites were going to find some new solution and reorganize society in a certain way that would create bunches of jobs, for example, the kind of best case scenario Green New Deal thing. That wasn't going to happen, and it still isn't going to happen. But at some point, this kind of like deep freeze of the pandemic is going to end, and it already has ended in many places, or is ending. And I think legitimacy will be further weakened, even more so, just because the behavior of elites and the messaging around the pandemic specifically, I think, has lost a lot of people. It's just, I don't believe you anymore. I don't believe anything you say. And they already faced that problem before. The problem is, I think it's also in a context of incredible fragmentation as well, right? And this kind of, culture wars and whatever else spiraling off into all sorts of crazy different directions, that it means that the amount of kind of mutual trust at a kind of social level is also pretty withered. And that makes it kind of intractable for any kind of mass politics to really emerge.
Right. One of the things I was thinking about what makes our moment unique is politics permeates all society, as if politics is somehow an ethical stance. And yet, there isn't. Mass politics can only manifest negatively and regionally. So what do I mean by that? You might have a BLM thing that becomes normalized, and DAW becomes normalized in like media and allegiance to the Democratic parties. But the actual riots are not, the riots that started off were not that, I don't think, at all. The fact that we call them BLM riots is even somewhat misleading, I think, because formal BLM was not what led to that. Its branding repeats what happened in 2000, 2012, 2013, 2014 under Obama, and so here we go. But what I find interesting is that it doesn't have a lot of effect on anything, and yet what it has shown in America, in particular in the states, is that the lower center levels of politics, which have been bureaucratizing at rates that people don't fully comprehend unless you're in the system. And I know this as a teacher, where like, I bring this fact up all the time, and no one really has. People until very recently haven't got what I was trying to say. What I was like, the cost of educating a student has doubled in the past decade and a half.
Wow.
The 93% of that goes to personnel, in almost every state in the country. And yet teacher pay in both real terms has declined. Who's getting the money?
Yeah.
Like, and what you see is, David Graeber talks about this a little bit in his book, Utopia Rules and Bullshit Jobs. But what you see is this massive proliferation of bureaucratic apparatuses, serving ostensibly democratically elected local bodies, but for politics so that nobody watches and people don't know. So, until very recently, who knew who was on their school board, really?
Yeah.
And what I found fascinating, and I pointed out at the beginning of the pandemic, is even though you had all these administrators, these massive growth of bureaucracy, when faced with the pandemic, what most of them did was try to outsource it to private corporations who themselves tried to outsource parts of it. So it was also a giant game of passing things around. In that gap, has this populist movement, particularly against education, has been pretty effective at fighting, frankly, the progressive dependence on these kind of low-level cultural institutions and educational institutions, not in forcing, critical race theory onto students, because frankly, I don't really think that ever happened. But to say that it was never, forced onto teachers who may have eye rolled at it, but did have to sit through the trainings, is false. They were definitely sitting through trainings on Kimberly Crenshaw. I know, because I've sat through them. And what I find ironic about all this is, like, the person who's the group of people who's benefited the most from this has not been any, black person or POC community. It's been the right being able to weaponize it, because its actual effect for people of color, because this mostly began in earnest during the middle end of the Obama administration, where it moved from very elite pedagogical institutions, and most of this either comes out of critical legal theory or critical pedagogy, into the public discourse, through blogs, which I do think people underestimate the effect of so many people going into community college, being educated by people who were affected by this, and then they're not being jobs. But we all have blogs now, so this is now widely disseminated, and what was just a campus cultural war issue becomes seen broadly throughout the country. But I also think, when liberals would say, well, this is a campus cultural issue at elite institutions, they were right. I mean, most state schools didn't deal with any of this. That's true. But the culture wars were set in these terms. And frankly, the right is far better able to weaponize it. And this is not the first time they've done so either. I mean, you go back to Reagan's kind of usurping of conservatism from the Goldwater faction. They also used Alka-Lindseyite methods while also complaining about Alka-Lindsey, why they did it, et cetera, and so forth. This is a tactic that's at least 2 generations old. But we've seen that here in America, and what the left and even liberal progressives have not fully dealt with is this has been exhausting to their own ranks, even if you look at the opinions of, like, Gen Z, who are all, quote, super woke, unquote, that like there's an exhaustion with this cycle, and that a lot of people have realizing the self-policing was at best premature and probably a bad idea, even though they're not willing to go and say that, like, well, this obsessive focus on using tech to fight our enemies and this, that, and the other was totally a bad idea. They're not willing to do that, but they don't really do it in the same way anymore. So this is a very long-winded way of getting to the next question, though. In Latin America, in general, and I know more about Spanish-speaking Latin America than Brazil, the urban centers have had this same tone, but the left response has been all over the place. I mean, if you look at Peru, Castillo and company are not from that urban left core. They have completely different concerns, which is a mixture of like what you might call peasant populism, indigenous populism, and some Marxist-Leninism, and then a willingness to make allegiances with these like urban progressives. But it's a tense allegiance. It's important to put in the context, though. That's in a context of a country that is not particularly developed, even by Latin American standards, outside of Lima. What have we seen? Chile, you've seen a populist revolt, the reverse of the Pinochet constitution, and a kind of, left of center leader emerge out of that. But Chile's urban cores probably resemble, as far as their cultural concerns, very similar to the U.S.
Yeah, Chile more than anywhere else on the continent, really. But actually, I'm going to take the opportunity to kind of make a bridge between what you were saying about critical race theory and culture wars and so on, and Brazil, because just this week, Bolsonaro's guru died, and he's resident in Virginia, actually, Olavo de Carvalho. And he's, conspiracy theory, an astrologer, blah, 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 dismissed by a lot of the left or ridiculed at the same time as this kind of tendency to create a demonical figure out of him who, controlling everything or whatever.
Similar to Bannon?
Similar to Bannon, but definitely wackier than Bannon.
Oh, okay.
Much wackier than Bannon. But also, not an academic, kind of self-taught, whatever. And, a guy who's actually read a lot of the left, right? I mean, still decides that, communism is still a real threat, even throughout the whole kind of end of history period was like, no, the communists are still there. They're going to come back, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, sees identity politics as a form of Marxism, sees it as cultural Marxism, uses the term quite explicitly. And I think being a good obit of him just today, it kind of described him as an anti-Gramscian, also trying to use a bit like the anti-Saul Alinskyites of the American right. Similar sort of vibe, trying and also believe ultimately that culture or politics is downstream from culture. Right. And that's something which, is important to learn, I think, that the culture is not a good terrain for the left. That's not where these things should be fought. It's inherently, I think, the terrain of the right. And I guess we can get into the kind of philosophical questions about why that might be. But I mean, I think I don't think do you disagree with that?
No, I think culture. I think the left focus on culture was actually out of two. In the United States, out of two mistakes. One that I've even seen Americans in Europe parody, and I won't call them out, but some of them are actually fans. But that basically judicial tort law has been the only real force for progressive change in the United States, which I find ridiculous, but was the model of the 50s, 60s progressive movement. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the left, for a long time, saw, frankly, its cultural concerns and the concerns of a need for rentier and entertainment capital to expand to more groups than it had traditionally held, to overlap so much that it seemed like, basically the movement of capital and the movement of the culture of the progressive left was similar. Despite, people talking about how capitalism was racist or this and the other, that the actual recuperation of radical politics into, capitalist marketing made them feel like, well, but this may be an area in which we can consistently win because capital will be on our side. And in general, and even in cases like BLM, this is true. And reasons why are clear just by looking at demographics. Like you don't have to believe that like woke capitalism is like a Gramsciite conspiracy to just look at like, well, by 2050, like places like Brazil, there will be no singular majority racial group in the United States. And so like if we want to continue expanding, it is best to get ahead of that, and also get ahead of that in who we appoint to leadership positions and this, that, and the other. What I think we've hit now is there is a hard limit to that because of things that progressive leftists have not really wanted to look at, and that is tensions between these differing identities themselves. That BIPOC, the notion of BIPOCness in itself actually hints at the tension.
Yeah. I mean, I think the U.S. is ridiculously sectarian. But that's maybe but that's not the terms under which it's normally spoken about. But I think it is sectarian. But kind of ethnic identities are so reified in the U.S. and consistently reified, even by those who might be critical of that notion, that it's very difficult to get past it. I'm always struck by talking to Americans, and people will just gesticulate to like a community or whatever, as if it's like a discrete, real thing. And not internally contradictory and whatever. And of course, that has a real effect, in terms of actually making people's self-conception be like, yes, I am part of this community, or I am this type of person. And it's, spiraled off into all sorts of forms of kind of new or postmodern forms of identity, not just kind of I'm Latino, I'm Black, but I'm this type of person, this type of marketing category. And I think that gets continually reified by capitalism itself. So that's very different from Brazil, where, first generation immigrants just get dissolved into being Brazilian. And there is no hyphenated nationality here, really. Maybe the Japanese community, which is very large in São Paulo, it's the largest Japanese community outside of Japan, is in any way kind of like, oh, Japanese Brazilians, but they're totally Brazilian. I mean, there's no sense of like, separateness or of a discrete community. It's all class. It's just class, much more nakedly. But I wanted to return, I guess, to this notion about culture, because I think what makes the leftist embrace of the terrain of culture so damaging, especially, through the end of history or kind of after the end of mass politics, is that without any kind of material gains, it all becomes about culture. And the left has an escape valve into culture, especially because it inhabits those institutions which are insulated from the market. So it inhabits kind of more cultural institutions, whether it's arts or academia. So that's part of the story. But the other thing is that what has happened, and especially I think this is very clear in Europe, but in the US as well, is that material, the loss of a future, effectively, and kind of genuine material losses and loss of a stake in society, lack of agency, has been reinterpreted as cultural loss. And this is very clear, I think, across Western polities. And as a and if you feel like there's, that instinctively or necessarily provokes a conservative attitude to culture. That culture is not something that you build or that you make or that you do, but it's something that you have to preserve, that it's something that is part of you and that you have to hold on to that. And that's, I think, very clear throughout. I'm thinking particularly like of Western Europe, like we're losing what it means to really be French, because of immigration, for example. And so that's why immigration becomes such a flashpoint today, because it's seen not as like, oh, well, these are other workers who we can be allied with, we can have solidarity with, but they are people who are further diluting our culture, which already the elites have taken from us, or that has been lost somehow because, maybe it's not self-consciously thought of this way, but, capitalism has dissolved what we knew as our culture, and we don't have that anymore. And so, political problems and questions of political economy become dissolved into cultural ones. And then if the left is coming in saying, we're going to completely radically transform the culture and, move over boomer, give up your, stop waving your American flag and whatever, that is just going to feel like yet another threat, yet more dispossession. And I think that's very dangerous. And I don't mean that we should, try to ape or adopt kind of culturally conservative tropes as a way to re-engage with the masses or something like that. But I definitely think that the opposite to that, which is the current kind of left liberal attitude, is very dangerous and alienating. To turn to Brazil, because I think that I started talking about Olavo de Carvalho, who recently died. Brazil never really used to have a kind of neoconservative cultural movement. And now one has developed. And, Olavo de Carvalho, like one of his books sold 300,000 copies. Brazil is a country of 300 million. So, that's quite a lot. And it's a country where people don't read very much. I mean, there isn't a particularly strong literary culture. You don't see people reading books on the metro, for example. So, and it's mainly kind of online thing that's been created of, angry young white men, mainly middle class, upper middle class. But nevertheless, there has been a sort of a mass base to Bolsonaro's sort of reactionary turn. Or not his reactionary turn, but the kind of he became the receptacle for this radicalization of the right, which in large part is kind of cultural and culturalist, primarily concerned with that, and sees identity politics as threatening the integrity of the nation. And identity politics, I don't even mean like wacko kind of US style internet identity politics. I mean just like anti-racism struggles, which are essential in Brazil, because Brazil is still a very racist society, just in terms of just everyday life. And so, and in Brazil, race correlates so closely with class. You might as well be talking about class. You don't have a kind of white working class which sees itself as separate from Black people. I think you were going to ask me about misconceptions that the kind of the North American left might have about Brazil. One is that, for the love of God, do not read Brazilian racial relations through the lens of the US. In fact, don't read anywhere else's racial relations through the lens of the US, because the US is very particular. And even though Brazil was a slave-owning society and was the last to abolish slavery in the Western Hemisphere and all that, it still has a different sort of relation. Because you didn't have the integration of poor whites into this sort of Herrenvolk democracy that you had in the US. That never happened in Brazil. So as a consequence, you don't have the kind of communitarian tensions among the masses in the way that you do have in the US. Where was I going with this? I don't know what the question I was.
Well, I find it interesting though, the effect this has had on intellectual leftists and progressives across the world. For example, I like to point out that even the UK, for all of its history of imperialism in Africa and East Asia and etc., the UK uses US racial terms, uses US racial frameworks, but they don't actually share them with us.
Yeah,
like whiteness is different in the UK than it is in the US. In fact, the US is, and so I don't want to call whiteness progressive, but the US's view of whiteness is more expansive, and it's, and that's a culture that is very close to ours. I mean, I would say that, like, yes, you can read Canada maybe in the same, because the distinction between Canada and the US in terms of culture is largely a political invention of Canadians. But, and I say that to sting some people, but I also think it's basically true. When I was in South Korea, amongst expatriates, no one, including the Americans and Canadians themselves, could immediately tell the difference between an American and Canadian when they spoke, or what they spoke about, with the exception of mentioning health insurance. Whereas that's not true for a Brit and an American, or a Brit and a Canadian.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote this piece last year, 2 years ago. Who knows? Time has no meaning anymore. But called "The Triumph of American Idealism," about the spread of this global BLM, where American lenses end up being adopted because of the internet globally, and that there's already the kind of the kind of feeling of post-history where history loses all its materiality. You don't really have any people don't even know about their own previous histories of anti-racism, whatever, and so everything just gets dissolved into in the case of the global BLM, of this sort of narrative of white guilt, of whiteness in places where it makes absolutely no sense, in kind of Eastern European countries, which have like no, significant non-white population. And in any case, it would be kind of Roma populations would be the kind of victimized ones, just stuff that just makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't even make sense in the UK, as you were pointing out. So, yeah, I think it's really problematic that we, I have ended up, despite being like instinctively cosmopolitan and internationalist, defending to a certain extent some sort of national enclosure or some restatement of the importance of boundaries and borders, at least to kind of think through your own history and your own problems and the particular contradictions of your nation in its history, which seems like an obvious thing. And if you're a Marxist, you say, well, if you read stuff from the 60s or whatever, it would use that language. But now that's seen as a controversial proposal, because it's like, no, but that means that you're anti, that means that you want to close borders to immigrants or something. It's like, no, absolutely not. It's the point is that just as a kind of intellectually, that there needs to be a certain kind of shared mental national space in which you think through these problems. Otherwise, it just gets dissolved very much in the way that, it kind of folds itself into the kind of globalized financial immaterial sphere. And that means any materialist politics loses the ground on which it stands. So I think that's really problematic. And, funnily enough, to kind of go back to Brazil is, to a certain extent, because it's a kind of continental-sized country, a little bit of a world unto itself. And culturally, there was a study that recently came out from like Spotify, published some data. It's the country which most listens to its own music out of anywhere in the world, right? In part because there's a huge kind of cultural production, and music is probably Brazil's most important art. But nevertheless, despite that sense of kind of cultural insulation, and importantly, it has its back turned to the rest of Latin America. The only people in Brazil who are really Latin Americanist or feel Latin American the only people who really feel Latin American are probably the left, or sections of the left, who have always been more Latin Americanist. Everyone else doesn't feel that. And in fact, the only time a Brazilian might come to conceive of themselves as a Latino or as Latin specifically is when they go to the US, and lots of Brazilians in Massachusetts, for example, and they get called a Latino, like a Mexican is, and they're like, oh, whoa, we're Latino too. It's just not part of the Brazilian kind of conception. It's always had its back turned to the rest of Spanish speaking Latin America. Despite that, though, you do see the growth of US style identity politics. It's not been immune to that. And I think on the Brazilian left as well, certain kind of, and it's because it's transmitted through kind of, the postmodern academy as well, and filtered down into kind of left-wing organizations and so on. Also certain, conceptions maybe of whiteness, which are spoken about, which again are imported from the US and don't really map onto the Brazilian social formation. And that's, that's problematic. In that regard, you have had a certain element of kind of culture war develop in Brazil, which didn't used to be the case. Brazil used to have, I think, incredibly deep class chasm, incredibly deep inequality, but never really the kind of cultural divides that have emerged in the past, since 2013, really, which was, when you had these big street protests, big mass movement, which was in Kuwait, sort of social democratic around social demands, but which became, anti-corruption and was eventually channeled towards or co-opted entirely by the right. And so suddenly you have especially in the urban centers, a kind of, and most definitely on the internet, a kind of cultural polarization around kind of center left liberal PT supporting group who are, in favor of cultural tolerance, openness, diversity, and so on, and the kind of Bolsonarista right, or not, and nowadays maybe not necessarily Bolsonarista, but kind of ultimately defined by its anti-pechismo, or its hatred and loathing of the Workers' Party and what it represents in defense of kind of either anti-corruption or traditional values or Christianity or so on.
I mean, so the you are also seeing the negative partisanship that we saw develop both in the United States, but also in Europe, frankly, develop in Brazil as well.
Yeah.
What I find interesting about this is while there are class characters to these different groups in the US, and I'm sure there is in Brazil too, they cannot be said to be properly speaking clear class politics.
Yeah.
I mean, because even in the United States, the bourgeoisie is split between the two parties and what they side with, depending on what industries you're in and what regions you're at. I mean, and I think it's interesting you mentioned Brazil being a continental-sized country. I mean, in the case of the U.S., both in terms of population and in terms of physical size, it is the third largest country in both areas. I do think people maybe over homogenize U.S. politics and U.S. understanding of the world, and unfortunately, the left, even we'll talk about the working class, but they're really talking about working class New Yorkers of specific sections of the working class, etc. It is not that those people aren't working class. Like some people will say they're all PMC or whatever. That's not true. But they are of a specific region with specific interests and and a specific cultural and milieu that comes out of those specific interests, in which I think this is more to your point about focusing on culture being bad as a policy for the left. Because I also think we have to admit that these cultural interests don't come from nothing, and they're not just like regional affectations that have no implications. They're partially based on like the kinds of industries and stuff that flourish in those areas. And the left has, I think, because of the internet and because of its presence in very large cities like New York, LA, Berkeley. Portland is a separate weird case that we'd have to talk about, and it's a kind of a weird outlier. But that it over concludes about its size from this, and then also because the left in the United States has historically been so tiny since the 1950s that like 100,000 people historically is massive for compared to what it's been able to muster since at least the mid 60s. But there's no look at that in the context of a country of 360 million. So, I think this has really skewed things. And what I find increasingly frustrating, and one of the goals of this channel now has been, don't take those assumptions, not even to other places of the US, but definitely not to the rest of the world, because they do not apply. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit, though, about how much of this has come out of this perpetual crisis in Brazil, particularly since the end of the BRICS coalition.
Yeah. I mean, do you mean specifically in reference to the kind of culture war, or just in general? I mean,
I feel like the culture war may come out of the fact that like the perpetual crisis has kind of broken like parts of traditional Brazilian politics, and this is this fills in the gaps. But this is my ad hoc theory, just talking to you right now. It's not
it's kind of difficult to untangle. I think what's important to start with, I think, is that Brazil is a much less politicized society, I think, and perhaps North American observers will think, there's lots of radical movements, there's the landless workers movement, there's the Workers' Party, blah 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 blah. Brazil has never been particularly politicized, in part because its history is so almost kind of continuous, right, without big ruptures, and certainly not kind of real revolutionary moments. Its elite doesn't trace its history to a revolutionary struggle for independence or war in the way that most of the rest of Latin America does. It was a negotiated settlement with Portugal. The Portuguese crown even moved to Brazil. The kind of slave owning elite was transitioned into a new oligarchy. And only within industrialization do you start to get ruptures, and you go through a sort of populist period overseen by Vargas, a dictator who was a kind of kind of a developmentalist and actually had an element of incorporating a formal working class. It was kind of Brazil's brief Fordist moment from the 50s to the 70s maybe. And again, that only reached a limited section of workers. Brazil, you don't, even at its peak in terms of the kind of an industrial proletariat, it still was a very small proportion of the masses, most being poor, rural, and so on. Now, Brazil is a very urban country, right? It's important to mention, and that's a big difference to somewhere like Peru, for example. It's a very urbanized country, but the masses are in the peripheries of the big cities. And they are informal workers in large part. So it's a kind of sub-proletariat, as is often spoken about here. I forgot where I was leading to. I suddenly I embarked on this history of 20th century Brazil. But the sense of kind of more recent polarization is in sense a kind of coming apart of the order that governed Brazil from redemocratization onwards, because you had the rupture with the 1964 coup and dictatorship, which was very explicitly done as a sort of an anti-communist one, but really the threat was more that you had a rising working class who were making ever greater demands. And Brazil, as I've put it, I think, and this is not my original point, Brazilian sociologists and political theorists have pointed this out before, but that Brazil had a turning point moment just before the 1964 coup, where the incorporation of the masses into a sort of new compact, not in any kind of revolutionary or socialist sense, but could have seen Brazil continue on its course of industrialization with incorporation of the masses and to become a real, more kind of almost first world country. Or developed country. And instead, threatened as they were, the elites chose, with ample US support, to stage a coup to kind of implement wage repression and effectively have Brazil be less developed, but as a way of maintaining their class hegemony. And since then, nothing really has changed. So you had the mass movement behind redemocratization in the mid-'80s. You have the Constitution of 1988, which inscribed a whole bunch of social rights, but without really deposing the old oligarchy. So you have a kind of all these social rights inscribed, which can never really be met without further struggle, or that there will always be a further struggle in reference to the Constitution and these obligations, but which aren't really met. Social rights, which the U.S. Constitution by no means has, but nor does the French Constitution, for that matter, or many others. So you've had, but the period of redemocratization happens just at the moment of the end of history, the end of the Cold War, and so you get a kind of duopolistic competition between the center right and the center left. The Workers' Party, a genuine mass party, but which gradually, especially as it goes into power as of 2003, becomes hollowed out. Its base becomes demobilized, and industrial workers and trade unionists and trade union leaders become like pension fund managers within the state. And so it becomes really defanged. And when eventually the conditions for kind of the Lula, even when it was under Dilma Rousseff, but the sort of Lulista ganha-ganha, as it's called here, the win-win, right? The rich get much wealthier and the poor get a little bit better off too. Once the conditions for that sort of settlement evaporate with the kind of delayed effect of the global financial crisis, and particularly the end of the commodity super cycle. So around 2015, Brazil enters very severe recession, and the elites and the PT starts to lose support, and the elites take advantage. and have this parliamentary coup, which deposes Dilma Rousseff. That whole period was preceded by these 2013 mass protests, which continued on in opposition to the World Cup and so on, but then became channeled towards anti-corruption, which created this mass base for reactionary right-wing politics and for radicalization of the right. In fact, the center-right party, the main center-right party, the PSDB, was the biggest loser in all this. They lost more than the PT, who were kind of thrown out of government because they lost their base to a much more radical right. And that's what kind of started what has become this kind of polarization. But the polarization, again, it's kind of like 10% of the population against 10% of the population. At the extremes, maybe 20 and 20 at the most. The great mass of the population is not involved in this, not interested in this, not politicized either necessarily. So again, there's always this element of unreality in the kind of petista versus anti-petista, PT supporters or the left in general, and anti-workers party support anti-workers party. The right, effectively. So, yeah, I don't know what. Ultimately, I don't think the culture war thing is that particularly important. I think there's more interesting and important things to understand about Brazil, and particularly the withering of its democracy and the growth and importance of the military, which has always played a determining role in Brazilian politics and now has returned to the scene in a really big way. Maybe you can go into that if you want to.
Well, I would want to, but it's similar. Like, on one hand, we've been paying. You cannot read the United States into these other cultures, nor can you read it back. But there are ways in which there are rhyming trends. Like, for example, in the U.S., we have total social fragmentation, except that the military remains, even if wars are not popular, have not been popular since about 2004. The military remains the most popular institution in American life, private or public. And it has stayed its hands in U.S. domestic political affairs, and at times in which its neutrality has been, it wasn't neutral, such as some of the end of Trump's administration, even with his replacement of generals were more actually dovish but more conservative elements of the military. All that being said, the military in the U.S. life, I somewhat think is like the shadow in the background, as everyone's talking about things like low-key civil war, although they don't really mean civil war. What they mean is protracted insurgency.
Yeah.
And I've been saying to people, like, do you really think the military, the most powerful military literally the world has ever known, in terms of its sheer machine capacity and its percentage of wealth consumed and ordered, is just going to let the U.S. let the U.S. public do whatever the hell it wants as both sides become increasingly polarized? I don't think so. And what I've seen in other countries where the military's neutrality and removal from politics is not part of its history. I mean, in Latin America, everywhere it's got a history of juntas. What we see is the military in a lot of these places seems to be coming back into stepping into a very obvious role, but not quite predictably. Like, it is not predictably siding with the far right or with neoliberals or whatever. And what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, in Brazil, I think it is, but it's not predictable in the sense that it's not structured by the Cold War, and so you don't have so much obvious U.S. leadership. I mean, the U.S. is interested in preventing China from getting too much of a foothold, and you have the wars over 5G capacity and whether Huawei will come in or whether it'll be their own companies doing it and so on. But it doesn't have that Cold War. It's not put in that Cold War box. So I think that makes it a little bit more unpredictable. But in Brazil, I mean, on the one level, it doesn't have the same symbolic role as amongst the people in that it does in the US. Brazil's military hasn't really ever get engaged in any serious combat abroad, other than, really in the Second World War, supporting American troops in Italy. And so, and that might be an important part of the mythology within the military, but amongst wider society, not really. And so you have a segment of the population who is very pro-military, but the military's role in Brazil has always been turned inwards. It's always been about internal policing, effectively, right? And internal order, not projecting external force. And that changes the kind of the composition of the thing. Brazil's military is, like, above all, corporatist. It sees the military sees itself as a corporation separate from the rest of society. It's not kind of permeated through society. If you ask people, what does the military do? They say they paint roads, because that's what that's what military privates do. They paint, or they, conscripts, they paint kind of the kind of side of roads like white, to kind of make it look nice or whatever. They don't do anything, right? That said, it's the largest army in the Southern Hemisphere. It's the largest in the Western Hemisphere, bar the United States. And you have the military police, and that's very important because it's a militarized police force, which is a legacy of the dictatorship, which is the largest body of troops in Latin America. And that's just the police force. That's not the kind of army, standing army or reserve army, anything like that. And so you don't have the kind of glorification of the military amongst wider society as you do in the US, but it has functioned as a kind of support for democracy has fallen, especially both amongst kind of the elite, but also certain more reactionary sections of society. That that the military stands in for order, and as it always has done, that things are just getting too messy, that there's too much crime, and obviously the security situation has significantly deteriorated over the past 20-30 years. There's 60 million murders a year, and that probably understates the full number. Brazil has so many people who have emigrated. I think there's like 4 million Brazilians abroad, and out of a country of 210 million. And, many people cite, no, the security situation, it's just untenable. I don't like living there. And of course, these tend to be more middle-class Brazilians who are able to emigrate, or upper sections of the working class. But nevertheless, the security situation does create a demand for authoritarianism. And Bolsonaro has very much, made use of that. The other thing about the military, though, and I think, kind of to return to the politics of the moment, and looking at what's going to happen this year, with the election, is that the military party, and this is how it's referred to in Brazil. The military party has returned in such a big way through Bolsonaro, but it has occupied huge swathes of the state. So positions in the civil service, which require nomination, have been filled en masse by the military. So something like 30,000 civil service roles have been filled by military personnel. And there's a huge number of elected officials at state and federal level who are military personnel as well, congressmen, senators, and so on. And so there's this kind of so they enter in as individuals, but ultimately it creates a sort of chain of representation for the military throughout Brazilian politics, through the state. So it's not just the military as this corporate body outside who might launch a coup, but the military already transmits its interests through the state in a massive way. And that was something that possibly one of the biggest errors of the PT period in power was that they never challenged the military. They came to a sort of accommodation. The military were fairly quiet then, looking after their corporate interests, just wanted to make sure that they got paid, basically. But they never challenged the role. There was never a truth commission until Dilma Rousseff came in. And that alienated the military so much that already began the process that we're seeing today of the military's repoliticization and re-entry into formal politics. So, unlike other countries which had a dictatorship, had torture, and so on, Brazil never really had a coming to terms with its own history. And so the military still lives off and glorifies the revolution, as they call it, the revolution of 1964, that they saved Brazil from communism, and that they were, great times of growth and employment and so on, and that there was no corruption. all untrue, by the way, but that still hangs over Brazilian democracy, and it means that I'm totally critical of the PT's alliance with the center right and try to create this broad base, but you can see this 2022 election as a choice about Brazilian democracy itself. That's what's at stake. Not a kind of very withered democracy, but the defense of that versus Bolsonaro winning and the continual entry of the military into politics, and perhaps maybe a kind of Erdogan situation, I guess, where democracy is withered away from even to a greater extent from the inside, the kind of formation of a sort of constitutional dictatorship or something like that. And so that's very worrying. And I'm going to end up voting for Lula. I'm totally not a lesser evil guy in any stretch of the imagination. I wouldn't necessarily campaign for Lula, but I'll probably end up going and voting for him, certainly in the second round, merely on that basis. Not because I think it's a lesser evil or he'll prevent harm, but just because Brazilian democracy is at stake. So, the conditions for struggle will be better with him there rather than another 4 years of Bolsonaro.
This is interesting to contrast to the U.S. position. I mean,
and I wouldn't have voted for Biden. I mean, I think if I were American, I wouldn't have voted for Biden against Trump. I wouldn't have voted because American democracy is not under threat by its military, or certainly I don't think Trump was going to launch a coup. And I think the kind of January 6th stuff is nonsense. People are actually worried here. People talk, journalists talk about like, well, there's a real concern that if Bolsonaro loses, there's a January 6th situation. I'm like, no, January 6th was like nothing. There's actually a very in the kind of most fevered imaginings of American liberals, what January 6th was, that might really happen here. Not the real January 6th, which was nothing.
So one of the things I would say about the U.S. is the U.S.'s faith in democracy is eroding. I say that faith, not belief, because all sides in the U.S. actually claim to believe in democratic values, regardless, including the people who think the election was stolen and support anti-democratic reforms on the state level. They think they're protecting democracy, at least the base does. Politicians, it's another matter. But the faith in democracy has completely eroded, nearly across the board. And also faith that the political elites will give anybody anything they possibly want has eroded too, because if you look at opinion poll after opinion poll, nobody really wants Biden versus Trump in 2024. I mean, I think something like 68% of the populace says they don't want either candidate. And not surprising, those are the two least popular candidates in modern presidential history. And by modern, I mean going all the way back to the 1920s, like almost 100, not almost, you have to literally go back 100 years. I mean, Joe Biden is more unpopular than Jimmy Carter. Trump was more unpopular than George H.W. Bush. So that's where we're at. It's also interesting to think how, though, this is leading us to maybe misunderstand the pink wave, to see Lula as a manifestation of the pink wave. I talked to you off air about Glenn Guidron getting in trouble for talking about how Lula was going to be like Biden, and that was seen as a turning against Lula. And while I also in Brazil, if I was a Brazilian, I think I would vote for Lula given the stakes, which seem to be much more acute than in the United States. I have to admit, Greenwald does have a point that Lula's version of the Workers' Party is, his leadership is like that of Obama, and even Obama himself recognized it at the time. And I think we should look at what that actually means. I think, left support of Obama would have been high if, say, Trump had actually jailed him in the United States, even briefly. even amongst some of the far left, but that's not what happened. And so it's easier to have a clear-eyed view of his political legacy, which I think even centrist liberals don't think has been particularly great. So
yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
I think like it's important to restate what the pink wave was, and its coherence as a thing is kind of difficult because Bolivia and Venezuela were those two together radically different from what happened elsewhere. But almost everywhere, and Brazil's the exception here, but almost everywhere you had a revolt against neoliberalism that took various different forms, street protests and so on, insurrection, whatnot. That which happened in Venezuela as well, actually, which led to Chavez. But what's important to know is that these pink wave governments were all propelled by this revolt against neoliberalism, but all once in power took the path of least resistance. Again, Chavez and to a certain extent Evo Morales are the exceptions here. But it's definitely the case elsewhere. It's definitely the case in Argentina, definitely the case in Brazil, where they, in many ways, assuaged the worst aspects of the crisis while continuing on a road which would deepen the contradictions which gave birth to the crisis. And that's something which we saw then explode later on once the good days were over and the commodity super cycle came to an end. So like, for example, two major factors in Brazil, and they're very closely connected: deindustrialization and financialization. Brazil is like soy country. Brazil exports soy and beef, and that's what it does, as if it's like a very, Brazil was a industrialized country which had a big auto industry, and was on a path, as I've already said this, was kind of on the path to becoming a kind of more, industrial power, and has become, a primary exporter, and incredibly financialized. And this is at kind of all levels of society. So people, the uptake of, for example, financial speculation amongst the ordinary population, gambling on the financial markets is surprisingly high for a country which has a lot of poor people, of course. But what Lula did, and one of the ways in which he, I guess, softened the impact of neoliberalism, was by deepening neoliberalism, and that was, for example, offering a lot of credit. There was a huge growth in private universities, and funding for that, and often very poor. The public universities in Brazil are the best universities, and the private ones are bad. There's a huge growth in private education. There's a huge growth in private healthcare as well. Even though Brazil does have a national health service, the amount I think spent on private health insurance, which only about a quarter of the population can afford, is greater than the National Health Service budget. And local kind of state budgets or state health budgets are financialized as well, and so they're kind of played on the stock market as well. So that degree of financialization, and the dominance of the big banks in Brazil is really eye-watering. So they've been able to maintain high interest rates, even though even as the interest rate actually has eventually fallen. Brazil had ridiculous interest rates in the 90s and 2000s, which again the Workers' Party did nothing to change, massively, which was an anti-inflation measure, and the Workers' Party kept all those anti-inflation measures and inflation targeting that were instituted by the previous neoliberal government of the PSDB. So, Brazil is the weakest, the pinkest, the lightest pink of the pink wave governments, and to see Lula as in some way having done anything remotely radical is wrong. I mean, the only thing you could say really is that the Bolsa Familia program, which kind of existed in various different parts, but he consolidated into one and amplified the funding for it, yes, did take millions out of poverty. And it's remarkable only because Brazil's history is so terrible that really counted for something. But it's worth contrasting that. Bolsonaro, despite himself, he didn't want to do this, but Congress twisted his arm into providing emergency payments during the pandemic, which at its height reached like 600 reais for a family. That had the largest impact on the Gini coefficient in Brazil in its history. well, maybe there are periods of growth where I'm not really sure. But, in its recent history, the Gini coefficient actually improved. Inequality went down just because of this payment of, maybe $100 to people. And Bolsonaro's approval ratings shot up during that period. Once they ended, they fell back down. And so what's happening now is not some radicalization or even particular politicization behind the support for Lula, who, according to some polls, is polling at like 40-50% even. But it's literally, and many people are talking about Bolsonaro being reelected. It is literally just inflation. And it's the kind of global inflation problem, which is driven by supply shortages rather than demand, right? It's not like people, labor unions fighting for higher wages, which is leading to kind of inflation, right? It's just supply shortages, which is, again, it's a global story. It's not particular to Brazil. Like that, and the way that has eaten into people's incomes, that people cannot afford electricity, they can't keep the lights on, they can't afford food. That is what has damaged Bolsonaro. And that's landed the left, such as it is, with a kind of easy run to the presidency, and so that's where we are.
It actually sounds somewhat similar to how Biden came to power in the United States, although different in the fact that inflation is probably going to take Biden out. Worrying about that also makes me worry about the stability of any Lula government, because these conditions are not going to go away.
I mean, already the Peruvian government is like super precarious, right, in terms of pink wave. Chile, I think, the whole rewriting of the constitution, although, you think that's definitely important, was in a way a sop to kind of neutralize the street movement. And of course, the pandemic, again, also came at a handy time, because it was at the end of 2019 where you had these mass mobilizations, and it was, kind of broad based. You did have the kind of urban liberals, but you also had indigenous and peasants and whatever else, and workers. So all that I've said about the pink wave, about them following the path of least resistance, that was in the conditions of, being able to implement programs of, or implement policies, have a general approach of win-win. And there is no win-win anymore. There's class confrontation. There's one side wins or the other side wins. And they're not going to be willing to, I don't think any of these governments are going to have the popular support to force any sort of confrontation. And like, what's going to happen in Brazil? What it seems like Lula's program is going to be to try to amplify credit. So again, like make neoliberalism work for people better. Again, which just deepens the crisis in a longer term sense, makes the country more beholden to finance. And, like, I'm not just like a developmentalist, but I have a lot more time for kind of national developmentalism than I guess this kind of, progressive neoliberalism at any rate. So, the conditions are incredibly straitened, and it's a lot of this is kind of, the so-called kind of Wall Street consensus as it's emerged now, right? Where low and middle income countries are enmeshed in the kind of global financial network, depend not just on aid or the IMF, but actually on private financing. And it kind of works for them because they borrow in their own currency now, so they're not owing in dollars, and so just are able to raise finance that way. A lot of that is dependent on the U.S. pumping out dollars, and the kind of low interest rates. If the U.S. starts raising interest rates, and I think just saw the news today that the Fed intends
they're predicting to in March,
exactly, that cuts off the supply, right? And that becomes very difficult then for all sort of developing countries, and so that's going to kind of underwrite the whole situation for any eventual pink wave. And I think, if you try to kind of plot this forward, what does that mean then? The masses in Brazil have already a section of the masses disgruntlement with the situation in the mid-2010s was captured by the right. The right gave voice to a certain mass anger, which was framed purely in terms of corruption. And corruption means different things to different people. So, for the elite, the corruption meant, basically privatization and an end to state corporations. For the kind of the middle class, it meant, my small business doesn't get the same benefits as the big businesses, which have a, close nexus with the state. But like for a lot of working class people, they were also anti-corruption because they understood that, rightly or wrongly, and I think it's a sort of misconception, but that it was corruption and stealing by politicians, which meant that hospitals weren't well funded, that education wasn't well funded. And so in that situation, the kind of center left became targeted as avatars of corruption. I mean, that's what happened specifically in Brazil, but there's other cases in Latin America where similar things have happened. If the left has to, and then, I mean, this is like hardly a new story, but with kind of left-wing governments in power, but if they are left administering the situation and unwilling to to force a confrontation with the elite, and not just unwilling but also unable because of lack of popular support, they either get very quickly thrown out of government or left carrying the can for capitalist crisis. And then, the whole idea of any kind of left-wing or socialist politics gets thrown out with that, which is, kind of what happened, especially with kind of, amongst the masses, it kind of turned to the right. There's I don't buy, I'm not saying that there's like the Brazilian working class went to the right or something like that en masse. But a lot of people in the periphery, in the poor peripheries of São Paulo and Rio especially, voted for Bolsonaro.
Right.
Because that was the anti-political vote. That was the fuck you vote. That was the get these bastards out vote. And the bastards are the center left, or came to be the center left. So it doesn't look promising at all. I don't think people should be getting excited about a new pink wave, because the contradictions are going to be pretty intense.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's actually a good point to end off on. There's a couple of things that I said we were covered, but who knows? We might talk in a few months as things develop. People should check out BungaCast, and you should definitely read the end of history. If you were going to suggest anything to help people keep up with what's going on in Brazil that's decent that's decent for English language readers, what would you suggest?
I mean, Jacobin does publish some decent stuff on Brazil.
Okay.
His friends write for that. There's a piece actually which I read in the New Left Review blog, which was out this week. I forgot what their blog's called, but it's a very good piece on the financialization of Brazil. I can recommend that. And we're going to be covering Brazil on BungaCast as well, and we're going to get some guests on to talk about this. It's not just going to be me rambling on. So yeah, you should tune in as well to that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And
thank you.
And we are over and out.